spearhead? Is it just
That
revival?
was a comment and a question.
I think our participants are probably like, is this what the next hour, 15 minutes are going to be?
Yeah, maybe.
Much more switches.
Really plummeting.
Yeah.
Why don't we get started? Oh, wow, I think you're a baby.
Yeah.
Cool. Great. Okay. Hi. Thanks everybody so much for being here. Really appreciate everyone who's here with us on this Thursday. We're here, as you know, to talk about Discourse on Method by Shonni Enelow and David Levine, a new book from 53rd State Press. There's a link. There's a link to the book in the chat, and there's a discount code. You can take 20% off with the discount code Discourse+1. And there it is. It's so cute. Yeah, it's a really exciting book. It's in two parts. There's a sort of an essay by Shonni and a monologue by David. They're both about kind of theorizing and historicizing method acting. There's also a lot of very beautiful photographs. I really recommend buying the book so you can look at the images. And I'll just introduce everybody really fast, and then I'm gonna mute myself. But we're joined by Nick Pinkerton, who's a really great film critic. He's written for everywhere: The Baffler, Harper's, Art Forum, his Substack, 4 columns, all really excellent. Thank you, Nick, for being here. Shonni Enelow is the author of the book Method Acting and Its Discontents on American Psychodrama. She's also an associate professor of English at Fordham University. Is that right? Associate? Great. And David Levine is an artist and writer and a professor of theater and performance at Harvard. He's also an N+1 contributor in issue 32, one of my favorite issues. We excerpted his piece, Some of the People All of the Time, which originally appeared as a performance at the Brooklyn Museum. It's a really funny and amazing and indescribable piece. I really recommend it. And I'll just say that if you enjoy that kind of thing, the best way to help N+1 keep publishing it is to become a subscriber. So I'll drop the subscribe link in the chat too. But if you're not already a subscriber, I really encourage you to become one. Okay, and I'll turn it over to the panelists now. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Just also quickly wanted to thank Lisa and Mark and N+1 for hosting this, and to also double down on the subscriber thing. Like, I was a subscriber to N+1 for about 2 years, and so when that piece of mine got published, it was kind of a dream, because I really just did subscribe out of sheer admiration, and I continue to, and it's an amazing magazine, so subscribe. Okay, so really quickly, just so we can get to the meat of this, the book is, as Lisa said, it's in 2 halves. One is a piece by Shonni, and one is a piece by me, because we both, a few years back, found ourselves just producing a lot of work that was really kind of consumed with how weird the American idea of acting is, and how weird the American idea of self-transformation is. And so we wound up in a really fruitful kind of dialogue about these things generally, and it culminated in this book. And I'm gonna, without further ado, pass out to Shonni, but also just to also thank Nick for moderating this, because I'm a longtime fan of his written and spoken presence. So it was awesome that you consented to do this. Okay, over to Shonni.
Okay. So I'm just going to read a couple of sections from different parts of this essay. I bought a plane ticket to Madison, Wisconsin in a fit of panic during the summer of 2014. I had actually been in a semi-constant state of panic from the moment I signed my book contract the previous spring, certain that this apparently happy event would result in one way or another in some sort of ornate, shattering downfall, which I imagined in ever more tawdry and megalomaniacal images. But this was different. I hadn't visited the Wisconsin Theater Collection, where the 406 cassette tapes recorded at the Actors Studio between 1956 and 1969 have been housed since Lee Strasberg's death in 1982. I had to go, I told Michael, in the neutral voice of inarguable domestic imperative. I booked a flight from New York to Chicago, where I would change planes for Madison and arrive at a hotel near the university around 8 p.m. I would wake up the next morning and go promptly to the archives, where I would sit in meditative stillness and take rigorous notes for the duration of the workday. I would discover extraordinary things that would raise my argument to new heights by thoroughly corroborating what I already knew. And I would commune with the voice of Lee Strasberg, which would ensconce me in cooling mists of authorial legitimacy. As we landed in Chicago, it began to storm. The plane to Madison was delayed, then delayed again. I waited in the terminal and sent Michael pictures of the sky from my phone. My flight was canceled, and there wasn't another available until the next afternoon, meaning I was going to lose more than half my time at the archives. I called the only person I knew in Chicago, asked if I could stay at his place, and got in a cab. I met Josh our first year as theater majors at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. 2 weeks after we started college, we watched the Twin Towers burn from our dorm windows. He made up a bed for me in his living room, pushing aside beer bottles and paperbacks. After he went to sleep, I opened one of the books on the coffee table called The Guys and Gals of Beverly Hills 90210, which described the life practices and moral value systems of Jason Priestley, Shannon Doherty, and Luke Perry. The storm had ended by the next morning. Josh walked me to a car rental where they gave me driving directions to Madison. I was so worried about taking a wrong turn that I kept the radio silent the whole way. The Wisconsin Historical Society is housed in an imposing building on the east end of the University of Wisconsin campus, with a long row of Ionic columns embedded in the facade. I took an elevator up to the 4th floor to the Center for Film and Theater Research, where the archivists expected me. I'd requested 5 tapes, 3 tagged effective memory exercise. Not including the librarians, there were 4 other people in the room, which was brightly lit, with furniture that looked about 30 years old. The archivist reminded me that I could manually copy down whatever I liked, but that no recordings of any kind could be made of the materials. I assured him of my compliance. The voice of Lee Strasberg is anxious and strained. He repeats himself and digresses at length, and his verbal tics are ubiquitous, so to say, as indicated by the result of which. It's the voice and the speech pattern of someone trying to communicate something important. But as I listened to the audio tapes, it felt to me that somehow the content had gone missing or been transformed into a familiar sounding but indecipherable dialect. There were long stretches that made close to no sense of me, exegeses of plays I'd never heard of, long iterations of the same instructions to multiple actors that sounded both epiphanic and strangely blank. I was most interested in what Strasberg had to say about emotional experience, so I listened hardest during those sections. This is because I had a hunch that for all his talk about truth and authenticity, for all the language of humanism, his method actually pointed in a different direction, towards a cyborg emotionality, a machinic self, fired with the blowtorch of mysticism. I left the archives that night before it closed. I was tired of listening to Strasberg berate actors and monologue about nothing. His voices started blurring in my head with the voice of my grandfather, a psychiatrist and a controlling and narcissistic person. When I started doing the research for my dissertation on method acting in my 3rd year of graduate school, it seemed like a perfect way to use an otherwise wasted chapter of my life. But during the 6 years or so of working on it, I often felt like one of the studio actors on the tape recordings, uncertain, resentful, desperate for approval, and terrified by the specter of annihilation lurking around at every turn. I tried to go to bed early, but tossed and turned for hours. I wondered if I had food poisoning. I half hallucinated that I was stuck in Madison forever, trudging endlessly to the archives, imprisoned with the voices of the vengeful mid-century, slowly turning into something, maybe a pillar of salt. Strasberg was born in a small village in Austrian Poland, now Ukraine, in 1901. His family emigrated to New York, and he grew up on the Lower East Side, where he had small roles in the then thriving Yiddish theater. He recalled that world in his autobiography, A Dream of Passion. Surprisingly, for someone who believed that, quote, the experiences which a human being has gone through are literally engraved into the fiber in the network of nervous system, Strasberg's memories are riddled with absences. I have no recollection of what happened on stage, he writes, of his first experience performing. I remember the rehearsals only in the sense that I remember there were rehearsals. One of the memories he retained was a lecture given by the principal of his Hebrew school, who was also the head of the Progressive Dramatic Club. He was a strange, peasant-like man with a body and face that seemed carved out of clay, Strasberg recounts. He lectured to us about the history of Jewish drama, stressing its folk roots, its earthiness, and its sense of realistic characterization. It was as if one of the granite Egyptian statues was talking with a haunting, unchanging intensity. It's easy to see the connection between this description and Strasberg's aesthetic interests. What's more interesting is the imagery that Strasberg used to evoke the Hebrew school principle's vehemence. The strange peasant-like man with a body and face carved out of clay, of granite, changing as a statue. This is an image of the Golem. The Golem is a mystical creature from medieval Judaism, an anthropomorphic monster made out of clay and brought to life in an ecstatic ritual. According to some legends, the Golem is awakened when the rabbi creator stamps a Hebrew word for truth on its forehead and destroys when the first letter is removed. As a monster, the Golem in some ways prefigures Frankenstein's, the body without a soul, the dead matter enlivened and let loose on the world. It could also be a figure for the method actor, in whom the archaic past is awakened to embody the violence of the word. I spent the rest of the night violently throwing up in the bathroom. Getting sick by yourself in a hotel room in an unfamiliar city is an existentially rich experience. Deprived of the opportunity to theatricalize my feebleness for an audience, I could focus on nothing but the gross substances of my usually coddled body. In my feverish self-aggrandizement, I started to feel exalted, as if vomiting the contents of my stomach somehow got me closer to the pit of my bare life. The entire trip had been somewhat masochistic from the beginning. This felt like a literalization of the abjection that, in other forms, I'd secretly loved the most about acting. It was obvious that Lee Strasberg was cursing me from beyond the grave. There's another strange thing about Strasberg's memory of his Hebrew school principal, the comparison to an Egyptian statue in particular. I myself am the daughter of a Hebrew school principal, and I can tell you it's truly bizarre to compare one to an Egyptian. Perhaps the most important story in the Jewish tradition, the story of Passover, involves the flight of the Jews from their Egyptian slave drivers. But Strasberg's substitution of the Egyptian overlord for the Jewish peasant says something about the traumatized assimilationist longings of Jews in the post-war era. There's much in Strasberg's writing and the writing about him that speaks to that anxious conformism, the social climbing, the needy authoritarianism, the affected worldliness, the reverence for intellectual advancement. The Jewishness of method acting is usually only noted in passing. From one angle, this is an odd omission. Klerman, Strasberg, Adler, and Meisner were all Jewish. However, whatever is ethnically and culturally specific about their acting methods is not easy to discern in their writings, with their ubiquitous references to universal values, universal emotions, universal psychology. In fact, without that universalism, the basic tenets of method acting fall apart. How can you use your own emotional experience as fodders for your characters if all human lives are not basically the same? When I wrote a bit about method acting's repressed Jewishness in my dissertation, my advisor got really excited. "You should title this section, 'Call Me Shoshana,'" he said. I ended up cutting most of it out of the final manuscript. I don't know why, maybe he touched a nerve. It's true that the closer my research came to my own experience, the more I felt sucked into the method's orbit, rotating on its sun of self-exposure on the axis of Eros disgust. I was born at the end of the 20th century. I turned 17 in the year 2000. Here's an emotional memory. The first summer of the new millennium, I drove with some friends from Berkeley up to Humboldt County for the memorial service of the semi-estranged father of one of our classmates, a Vietnam veteran who died of cancer someone told me was from exposure to Agent Orange. The family owned a rambling property in the hills that he turned into a marijuana farm, and when we got there, everyone was out back behind the house, pitching tents and smoking. Maria's dad had 8 or 9 children from various relationships, and they were all gorgeous, auburn, and large. His memorial service was made up of spontaneous verse recitations, burning sage, and a dubious Native American ritual. His group of friends and girlfriends, though mostly gray and droopy, had put on their beads and belts and braided their hair, and stood there hugging the giant children and swaying arm in arm. I met an angel-faced teenager named Tommy, the blonde son of the property's caretaker. I remember the smoke from the end of the campfire and the rocky ground in the yard by the porch. It was a fantasy come true. It was a movie from the 70s. No, it was a movie from the year 2000 about the 70s, a pirated experience, party crashing other people's loss. The Vietnam War was exotic to me, even romantic, I was in the California of a Hollywood imagination. I was blithe, I was high, I could play 70s for a night, no problem. The detritus of the 20th century was there for that, beginning with the most saccharine cliches and ending with the death of the last and only Vietnam vet I knew. What strikes me now is not the superficiality of it, or even the cliche, but how well I played that role. I knew I was repeating. I tried to do it well. Tried to do it, with the illusion of the first time. And I have a hunch that many other people around my age have approximately the same memory. That night it could have almost been the 70s, as long as you ignored the dead. Thank you.
Okay, so the part I'm going to read requires just a second of explanation. I was doing an exhibition at a gallery in Toronto, and and it was sort of about this idea of like self-transformation. And there was a video in one room that was based on John Carpenter's The Thing. And then there were a set of prints that were appropriated images that were kind of transformed from the actor's studio, which are reproduced in the book. And the last artwork was a monologue called Edition of 8. And it was written, the speaker self-described themselves as the smartest artwork in the room. And it would regularly take possession of one of 8 actors who had all learned it. So usually when you walked in, there was usually somebody doing it, or somebody would soon be possessed by it. Kind of like, one of turning into Agent Smith in The Matrix. Anyway, this monologue is extremely obnoxious, very talkative, and does not shut up. So I'm just going to read, an excerpt from that. I always wanted to write this screenplay. This penguin-looking guy, short, white, ethnic, basically Richard Dreyfuss or Al Pacino or Dustin Hoffman or any of these guys who became stars in the early 70s, moves to New York to become an actor. He falls under the influence of Lee Strasberg, the inventor of method acting, at the Actors Studio. Riots going on, Vietnam, bombings, all that stuff. Our guy is passively involved. I mean, he walks by the demonstrations, he watches the news, but he's mainly studying his craft and working as a short order cook in Times Square and does some downtown semi-experimental theater. And one time he's helping out on a Jack Smith kind of experimental short shooting at the factory. And the movie's about Pollock, specifically about the afternoon in autumn 1951 when Hans Nemeth, a photographer and filmmaker, filmed Pollock painting, because supposedly that evening Pollock fell off the wagon after 2 years sober. That was the night he flipped the dining table over onto Clement Greenberg, because supposedly painting on camera, doing retakes, performing being a painter for Hans made Pollock feel like such a phony, such a fake, such an actor that he never recovered. Pollock never felt like a genuine artist again. Americans, so hung up on their authenticity, right? Pollock in a white t-shirt, painting. Brando in a white t-shirt, screaming. Chris Burden in a white t-shirt, getting shot. So primal. Anyway, during the shoot, something goes wrong. It's at the factory, so it's that kind of shoot, so everyone's on drugs. And the guy playing Pollock, I think it's Robert Quine, has a meltdown. He's on a lot of LSD, and during the scene where they recreate Pollock painting on glass, so Nemeth could get underneath and film him painting, midway through, the actor starts hyperventilating, and suddenly he puts his fist through the glass. He's so in character at the moment. He's so immersed in Pollock's anguish of performing himself that he plunges his fist through the glass again and again, getting huge shards of glass in his wrist, weeping, punching through glass again and again, crying, "This is how it ends. This is what happens. This is the new sublime." And it's the most compelling performance our Serpico-looking hero, who's just helping out on this film, has ever seen. But it's also the most aversive. You're standing back watching, but only because you don't dare get close. You're only an audience because you don't dare get close. This is all the trauma, all the naked humanness emanating in terrifying waves from the performer that Lee Strasberg is constantly trying to get out of him at the studio. And yet these waves are also fundamentally repellent. They make you into an audience. But it's like Rosemary says, this is no dream, this is really happening. And it really makes you wonder why people make such a big deal about catharsis, because this is actually what that feeling is like. And okay, The ancient Greeks were into it, but maybe celebrating that feeling only makes sense in a society that restricts the vote to upper-class males and encourages owning slaves. But the drugs. This guy's bleeding on the floor, still crying. They're all fucked up. How are they going to get this guy to the hospital? But they manage, and somehow Warhol's money takes care of the rest, but it's a long night of the soul for our guy. He doesn't know if he's ever going to be able to come up with a performance like that. He rides the subways, the C, the M, the 7, out into Queens, back into Manhattan until he sobers up and we see him, alone, wandering down Cornelia Street with his black leather jacket in the 5 a.m. light, the World Trade Center is going up behind him, and back to his 4th floor walk-up. He stands in the living room, backlit, and makes a fateful decision. His roommate, a playwright, is asleep. It's time. It's time to go. It's time to go to Hollywood and seek his fortune in film and TV. And because early 70s, he decides to drive. Aerial view of the West Side Highway now, that kind of acoustic guitar with wordless singing that always accompanies hitting the road montages in the 70s. We see him in the rolling countryside of Pennsylvania, powering down the interstates in Ohio, clocking endless hours straight through wheat fields on Kansas local roads. Everywhere he goes, he encounters lens flare. Everywhere he goes, he encounters salt of the earth types who are willing to share their table and break bread with him and are changed, no, blessed by his company in turn. Everywhere he goes, he meets women, daughters, mothers, either free spirits or yearning to be, who give him the gift of their bodies for a night and ask nothing in return. He beds down with communes in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, takes peyote, LSD, gets high, learns about sustenance farming and guitar, finds America, as Simon and Garfunkel instruct us to. It's basically an hour-long montage. And by the time he arrives in LA, his Malibu fording the 101 at dusk, the Capitol Records building rising up against the sunset like Skull Mountain calling out to King Kong, 10 years have passed and it's 1981. Don't ask me how. It's like a time warp. He doesn't even notice. Okay, so we're in Act 3 now. And our guy, should I give him a name? He lucks into an audition and gets the job almost instantly as the sidekick in a new TV show about a crime-fighting stuntman. He moves into a new home in the hills. He's a fresh new face, an up-and-coming young star. He's been seen dating Lindsay Wagner. He's still taking classes, still trying to improve his craft at the Actors Studio West, and in his spare time hangs out in Malibu with Lee Strasberg's daughter Susan and her abusive husband Chris and Lee's drug-addled son John. He's having a high old time, but he's a cipher. No one feels like they know him. His publicist frequently invites journalists to stress the fact that he does all of his own stunts, like a young Steve McQueen. And in interviews, he mutters sexy and cryptic things like, I just want to feel real, you know? He's still going to classes, still working on finding his truth, and midway through shooting for season 2, something terrible happens. Our guy's doing his own stunt, jumping from the roof of a 4-story building onto the winch of a moving crane in order to intercept a fleeing jewel thief on the street below. When the crane swings wide, momentum carries him smack into the brick face of the building opposite, and he lets go of the cable and falls 3 stories onto an awning and bounces off, landing on the street face down. He's not moving. Everyone is frozen. Give him room. Let him breathe. The emergency vehicle for the Paramount lot has been called. Slowly, he starts to get up on his own. His stuntman skills have saved him, taught him how to break his fall. He's on all fours now, still bent over, and he slowly rises to one knee and looks up. Everyone takes a step back. What's happened? Is he bloody? Is his nose broken? Are his teeth missing? He raises a hand to his face, still looking at the assembled crowd, and realizes there's no face there. There's a face-sized depression, crisscrossed with wires, transistors, chips. His plastic eyeballs dart left, then right. He turns his head and sees, about 20 feet away, his face, lying face up on the dusty soundstage street. He rises slowly to his feet, picks up his face, and walks away. He had no idea. This is, of course, the end of everything, career, friendships, all of it. In a coda, we see him months later, walking down the beach in Malibu or San Clemente in plaid shorts and a hoodie, faceplate off, scanning the lonely beach with a metal detector. The end. The end. And on that note, let's have a conversation with Nick.
Yeah. I should have said, oh, sorry, go ahead. No.
No.
I was going to say, I really feel embarrassed that I forgot to say thank you to everyone so much for coming, and to N+1 and to 53rd State and to Nick Pinkerton. That was all. Thank you so much. Now, please.
So, yeah, Shonni, when you first got in touch with me about this, and I got some sense of what the book was, this sort of bifurcated thing, I initially thought that, I'd have to pitch some questions to you and some to David, but what I found in the course of reading it is there's, I won't say overlap, but your two pieces are so much in conversation with one another that I have a lot of questions just for the both of you. And I want to just start out with this. I don't know how visible it is, but it's what divides the two essays in the book, and you probably can't see it terribly well, but it's like this diagram of method influence, and what it looks like nothing so much as like when William Peterson in Manhunter is trying to solve killings and is, got the like corkboard or the bare wall, this, sort of crime movie staple with pieces tying together. Sorry.
Should I share my screen for a second? I can show you this for a sec if you want.
Oh, we can't hear you, Nick.
Nick's audio just went out.
Together all these disparate pieces of evidence, and it does feel at times as though this is like a crime scene investigation, that you're trying to get to the bottom of something not prosecutable exactly, but something extremely deviant that happened in American acting at some point in the mid-century.
Yes.
And one thing that runs between both of the pieces is the sense of Lee Strasberg specifically as this Colonel Kurtz-ish figure. Even, Shonni, in the excerpt that you just read, you're heading to hear audio recordings of this, figure shrouded in mystery, introduced in more or less exactly the same way that the Colonel Kurtz figure is in Apocalypse Now, via these sort of vague, cryptic, rambling tape recordings. And then, David, you have a tossed off line in your piece where you refer to Strasberg as the dark heart of the 20th century, which is not going to fail to evoke the source material for Apocalypse Now. So I wonder if you guys could talk about, is this a case of just arriving at some of the same points while working along parallel lines, or how much were you in active dialogue and kind of batting the shuttlecock back and forth when putting this thing together?
Before we get to that, did you mention the title of Shonni's essay?
No.
I did not.
The title of Shonni's essay is right, which is another Apocalypse Now reference. Shonni, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could answer this question in a lot of different ways, but I guess the most like simple and practical way would be to talk about just a little more about the history of how the book was made. So, as David said, we connected we connected in 2015, right after my my book, Method Acting at Discontents, came out, and David had already been working on realist acting and its many tentacles for a number of years. So, when we got together, we realized that we were just interested in the same, or a lot of the same weird things about method acting, and that it actually hadn't been this kind of like secret or paranoid history had not reached the public consciousness in the way that we wanted it to. And then, David was doing this exhibition in Toronto, and I went and like did an event there, and that's the monologue that is in the book. And I was really just inspired by the way that he was talking about it. And so I went back and took all the like messy shit that I had not been able to include in my book because it was, as you put it, Nick, like not prosecutable. It was like not real evidence. It was like this kind of, conspiracist evidence. And I looked back at it, and I really wrote the essay in a lot of ways to be in dialogue with David's monologue. And so some of the ideas that ended up that made their way in there are actually from David. So the ideas sort of this like machinic self, I was thinking a lot about David's art object in his monologue. So, there was like I think there was an intuitive overlap in our interests, but then I wrote my essay after having seen David's piece. So I was also thinking a lot about it as I wrote it.
But I think also Shonni and I basically, ever since this also, I only found out about Shonni's book through Facebook, and this is probably the most productive thing I think Facebook has ever done for me, was introducing me to Shonni. But we've spent a lot of time since then, because we took a long time getting this book together, just watching movies. And we had kind of a field day watching Apocalypse Now. This was because it is like that in particular stages, because we're just watching it, we were like, okay, this is like two generations of method acting. You've got like the most famous of the first wave of 50s method actors, because there's two waves of it, right? There's like the first wave that comes straight out of the Young Actors Studio, which is like Brando, Monty Clift, like this generation of actors, and then Marilyn Monroe, and that's a whole other thing. But then you've got the second generation who become big in the 70s, which would be Pacino and Dustin Hoffman and
Martin Sheen.
Sheen
and Michael
right, and Martin Sheen. And what you see, and there's this famous, Shonni was talking about this famous story of like, Martin Sheen actually, being an alcoholic, because like all Apocalypse Now stories are just how fucked up it was and how fucked up everyone else was. And Martin Sheen kind of really being that drunk in the opening scene, and Coppola just letting the camera roll, and I hadn't been thinking about that when I was talking about putting a fist through the glass. But this idea of like, Martin Sheen goes upriver to find his spiritual father. Martin Sheen, the actor, goes upriver to find his spiritual father, Marlon Brando. And there's this weird, there's this weird kind of collision between two generations of this kind of messed up thing. And it did actually, what Nick is talking about is, we basically made a huge, one afternoon, this massively conspiratorial diagram that we later tried to clean up and turn into an art object. And we were never able to clean it up. It was like one drawing we made at a now shuttered coffee shop that we kind of reproduced parts of, that was just tracing all of the connections between, Lee Strasberg at the center, and like you have like the Panthers and Jane Fonda, and like Protest, and Lee J. Cobb, and like commies and Arthur Miller, and it just seemed to connect everything. So that's kind of, so we excerpted parts of the diagram in the book, although not the whole thing, but yeah.
And I had occasion to look at Apocalypse Now again about a year ago in these seemingly endless succession of versions that Coppola turns out. And my conclusions were very close to your own, in that a movie that I've never been able to feel particularly tenderly about, in part because I think it's of very little interest with regards to its ostensible subject, the Vietnam War. But when looked at as a movie about the method tradition, it's extraordinarily interesting. And Sheen in particular, in his kind of two best roles of the period, really seems to play the sort of haunted spirit of the method in the 70s. In Terrence Malick's Badlands, he's doing this extremely self-conscious James Dean impersonation. Here, traveling upriver to meet with Dennis Hopper, who is famously a Dean acolyte. But another sort of common theme in both of your pieces is, what about the people who didn't get famous? What about the people who passed through the Actors Studio, who are not this, extremely exalted list of alumni? And what is that process like for these rank and file members, Shonni, these credulous actors going back to the studio week after week, year after year, failing to get roles and living out your unfulfilling lives? And then, David, you have an extraordinary piquant line about an actor exercises re-experiencing child sexual abuse in order to land a walk-on in The Love Boat. So this is another sort of bridge, let's say, between the two halves, is this particular interest in the attrition and potential damage that comes for, not your Brandos and your Deans or whoever else you might want to cite, but for rank and file actors who are encouraged to draw upon their lived experience and turn that into a tool for performance. I wonder if you could speak about that a bit.
David, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that, one thing we sort of didn't say, if you are not, method is always really interesting as a spectacle, but one thing we sort of didn't say is that if you're not in like theater or film, basically pretty much every idea we have about acting in America and how it is descended from the method. So even though the method was officially kind of discredited as like over the top somewhere in the mid 80s and 90s, all actor training is still deeply influenced by it. And you see it whenever anyone's like, like the Joker is always a vessel for this kind of thing. Or whenever anyone like praises, Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver, like in Marriage Story, like the stuff. So on the one hand, it's discredited for being over the top. On the other hand, it's praised as a measure of commitment. So it does kind of infect the way we think about performance and self-transformation, like generally. But what that means also is so that was just one thing I wanted to say as an aside, but it's because of that, because American acting is so much about believing it, either believing you are the role, or becoming the role through research, or becoming the role through like reaching back into your deepest trauma. It exacts an incredible amount of effort and cost, because you always have to show how bad you want it. And if you read method transcripts, you read testimonials to like method teachers, like literally there was actually a walk-on on Starsky and Hutch, I think. But it was like, people are really talking about how so-and-so helped them get unblocked for a commercial. And like literally, it's for a commercial, but they're going through this incredible thing and they're paying a lot of money. And I think that I started out as a theater director who was kind of just aghast at the general practices of theater. And, one of my first kind of, I think the first solo exhibition I had, in a gallery I'd been collecting abandoned headshots for like 4 years from various agencies around New York. I would just kind of dumpster dive, and the rule was they had to have been sent in unsolicited. They had to have been thrown out unceremoniously. And the I don't know. I mean, I can't say much except just, you know, I always stay really interested in the people who don't become famous off to the side, and yet they buy into the system and its promises, and it exacts like an enormous cost, which is basically not elaborating at all on what Nick said, but yeah, that is a thing. I mean, the hero of this thing the screenplay turns out not to be such a big deal after all. Yeah, Shonni?
I guess just to add on to that, I mean, I think all of that resonates with me as well. I think that, though, for me, there's a weird autobiographical thing there, both because I was a acting student, so, you know, trained as they say, in, you know, some version of Stanislavski in acting, and, you know, when you go to acting school, you're surrounded by a lot of people who, like you, have, you know, grown up wanting nothing except to be an actor, and deeply believing that they can do it. And, you know, it's like the most cliche, pathetic narrative that, like, no, you know, so few people obviously become famous. So, you know, method acting, because it produced these schools and these institutions, proliferated these also-rans. I mean, that's like, you know, once you have an institution, you have to fill the institution with participants. And then, you know, because, you know, by definition, not everybody's going to make it. So it's this kind of production of failure that actually is like constitutive. But then I also think, what, sorry?
Oh, but it keeps demanding that you demonstrate the conviction. It's like
right,
a very high
right.
cost. There's other ways to be a failed actor.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, I think that, you know, the production, the manufacture of difficulty and the corresponding production of effort that method acting demands is really central to the way it works, to its structure. But then I was just going to say the other thing for me is I think about growing up in Berkeley, California in the 1990s, and always sort of feeling like I was in this, you know, surrounded by this like failed 1960s, and just feeling like everything that we were doing was this like bad repetition of some 1960s fantasy that never sort of like took off, like never actually got off the ground. And so I think there is something for me about, you know, that experience of like, you know, trying to repeat the supposedly original, you know, authenticity, and just, you know, knowing that it is actually, you know, even knowing that it's bankrupt, but feeling sort of caught in its repetition.
I feel like another shared strand of thinking that runs through both of the pieces is calling to question some received wisdom that would tend to group method acting in with all of these other mid-century American cultural phenomena that, you know, so often are kind of lumped together. Abstract expressionism comes up in your piece, David, but also the method is always sort of thought to be curiously like parallel to the beats and rock and roll and all of these things that are generally thought of as part of this cultural explosion that has something to do with freedom, liberation, self-expression, all of these things. And it seems both of you arrive at rather more sinister conclusions. Shonni, you write about the method as being emblematic of American post-Fordist work culture, this idea that you take your work home with you, you do not clock out at the end of the day, you are always, always, always on call. David, there's a tossed off line, it's not enough to just do your job, you've got to love it too. And I suppose this sort of common thread is how infringing this is, and how this thing that has traditionally been associated with this enormous burst of creative freedom is in many ways the opposite of liberating.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Shonni, I mean, I think Shonni, Shonni has a really great historical point about this, you know, because she wrote an essay which became very, very crucial in my thinking about this a few years back, called The Great Recession, about contemporary stardom and contemporary acting, which is a very different story. Maybe you should talk about that.
I should talk about that, like why, like.
Well, just what the moment is now, as opposed to what the moment, like
yeah.
Because it's a very different relationship to work, or it is or it isn't. But you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it seems pretty clear that in the mid-century, people really thought that like personal liberation was possible and achievable through various, you know, practices. And I don't really think that those are the terms through which anybody thinks about anything anymore. Exactly. And, you know, I think that, well, you know, in this essay that David's referring to, I write about the move away from method choreography in contemporary film acting, like mainstream contemporary film acting. And, you know, the conclusion I came to is that, you know, if in the mid-century, like, I mean, I think that actors are always fulfill our fantasies of what we wish we could be like. It's kind of a banal point, but so if, you know, if in the 60s, you know, the fantasy was that you were held down by repressive norms, but actually you were you know, a deeply feeling, you know, fully realized individual, and it just needed to come out. You know, now I think actually all people want is, you know, privacy. In some way, you know, I think that people feel like they're constantly being compelled or impelled to perform emotion, and that so mainstream film actors that people seem to most connect to, although with notable exceptions, which I think are those like anachronisms that people also like for their nostalgic quality, and that's where you get Marriage Story. But a lot of contemporary actors actually play this kind of refusal to emote, you know, as itself a drama where, you know, I'm not going to express my feeling, and you're going to watch me not express what you know I'm feeling. And that the fantasy there is that, you know, that you wouldn't have to give your whole self to your work, that you could hold something back, that there's like something to hold back that's not being, you know, completely instrumentalized. So is that what you're thinking of, David?
Yeah. Well, I agree. Like Kristen Stewart or Jennifer Lawrence or Michael B. Jordan or Robert Pattinson, like we're very, you know, they're not showing it to you. I mean, I think the only thing I'd add to that is, which I always kind of blew my mind, is, you know, there was this semi-viral tweet that accompanied Marriage Story where, you know, like during that ridiculous fight scene, you know, and then like someone did a scroll down of the actual shooting script, being like, can you believe all of this is scripted? And if this had been the 70s, it would have been like, can you believe all of this is improvised? Which pretty much tells you kind of all you need about the bridge and the relationship to work, you know, from one moment to another somehow, in terms of what's valued. So, or you know, what we think acting is an expression of.
I wonder, Shonni, I have some sense of the, you know, gestation of David's contribution. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you landed on the form of your piece, this personal essay, where your personal up the river narrative of heading to Madison, Wisconsin, and getting massively ill. My sense would be that your idea is mimicking the demands of the method in some way, drawing upon lived experience. Maybe it's too much to call it lived trauma, though it doesn't sound all that terribly fun. But if you could talk a bit about how you conceived this piece.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. Well, you know, I think you got it exactly right. That is, you know, what I was thinking about. But I also, I was also thinking a lot about this contemporary genre that is now ubiquitous, that's sometimes called like auto theory, which is really just sort of this version of the personal essay that seems to involve some kind of more research, I guess, or is sort of outside of what has for several decades been thought of as the mode of confessional writing. And I was thinking about it as a kind of as a development of an evolution of a certain like method way of thinking, which is about like sort of fusing your own experience with some historical structure, historical textual philosophical structure, which in method acting would be the literary structure of the character, of the dramatic character. But I think today is sort of more about seeing yourself reflected and articulating yourself through other people's thinking, which to a certain extent is what I do every day as a like scholar critic. That's something that we all do. But I think that if you push it really far, it gets into this territory of what I like the line in the section that I read for tonight was, circling on the sun of self-exposure on the axis of eros and disgust. Like, I think there's something very erotic about that kind of, confessional writing, that autoerotic, and there's also something profoundly repellent. And so I wanted to, lean into that and do what was in some ways the most, kind of embarrassing thing that I could think of, which was to sort of, be that self-revealing.
And that attraction repulsion thing is very interesting because so much of this text is extraordinarily critical of and harsh about the method and its processes, and yet this thing exists because very clearly there is some lure that you can't, it seems to be like a wound you can't quite keep your finger out of. And at one point you talk make a passing reference to the sort of attraction of acting as objection, and even shit.
We can still hear you. You're just frozen in a kind of.
But it's a good still.
Bemused still.
Like. Wait, is he there?
No, now Nick is not. Oh, he's coming back on a different. There you
hi,
are.
Nick.
Okay. It's okay. Now for a minute we get both of you, which is actually so the book. Like David has an image that is two actors playing the same role, and that's what we have right now. Sorry.
Yeah. Speaking of objection, the public shame of a shitty internet connection. But I mean, I wonder if you could expand a bit on that attraction repulsion, because not only do we have this idea of the allure of objection in performance, we also get a sense of like the method as like ipecac, the Gothic criticisms of emotional memory exercise, but also you pointedly spend a great deal of your essay puking your guts out. So the objections are certainly registered, but they're always sort of counterbalanced by these aspects that keep you circling around the topic.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that is true. And in my essay and in my thinking, I mean, I'm like, there have been plenty of like ideological critiques of method acting. Like that's like you can find a million of them, and they're good, they're worthwhile. It's not like that's bad. It's just, we're interested. I mean, speaking for myself, I was interested in doing something different, which is thinking about what is the continued investment in this particular way of thinking about performance. Like what is, and why, why do actors love it? Why did I love it? There's something profoundly satisfying about doing it. And it gets into something really, I think, like fundamental to what performance in a particular historical moment, like is serving to do. And I think, you know, so it's like you can like critiquing it away seems to me entirely beside the point.
Because we're all kind of seduced by, I mean, we're all in it. And I mean, I think I came to it through, you know, when I first started learning, you know, coming from theater, when I first started learning about sort of, you know, Marina Abramovich or Chris Burden style, like performance art, I was just kind of like, oh, you know, like method is discredited from one point of view, but if you think about it as, you know, if you think about it as like late 60s, you know, and turn yourself inside out art, it's actually completely in a continuum with this thing that it doesn't even speak to, but it's part of that. And I think, and I was living in Berlin at the time, and in Germany, you know, they were so puzzled by the American idea of acting because they were just like, wait, you do what? You believe you can what? And it really framed it, you know, because in Germany, like actor training is, you know, the character is a hand puppet over here, and you know, it's very Brechtian. Like you're not supposed to vanish into the role. And it was at that moment when, in trying to explain it, I realized that, right, you know, I mean, the dominant acting style of a culture or whatever, you know, is expressive of other beliefs in that culture. So in a country, you know, that says you can become anyone you want to if you just work hard enough, naturally you would get the method. Like naturally, this is what would happen. Is this kind of crazy, very confused, mystical idea of total self-transformation related to commitment. Whereas in German, it's like, yeah, it's your job. You go, you come. You know, it's not like there's none of this. So we're all in it, and that performance of authenticity is super tempting, you know. And I think so I think, yeah, Shonni and I both were like, there's much more crazy energies here that, you know, they're discredited in acting, and they should be because they're exploitative. But the energies are still like wild and interesting to think about. And the other thing I'd add would be something that, you know, the monologue, which is basically just like a collection of just random shit I thought of, that the monologue says is, you know, at some point I noticed that, speaking of vomit and everything else, self-expression, that weirdly, you know, in Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, the characters who bring Satan into the world are both hack actors. Like, you know, what's his name's role in Rosemary's Baby? He's a hack actor, and he sells Rosemary's womb to the devil so that he can get better parts than just commercials. And in The Exorcist, Ellen Burstyn plays a hack actor shooting a terrible campus protest movie. This is what she's doing in Washington. And these are really unnecessary plot points, and yet it's insisted upon. And these are actors, these are sellout actors who don't mean it enough. And somehow their profound sense of internal compromise is what creates this like hellmouth through which like the world is destroyed. But the crazier thing is that the hack actors are both played by actor studio method legends, Ellen Burstyn and John Cassavetes.
Right?
So you've got like hyper committed.
Didn't get into the studio.
Actors.
Made his own studio.
What?
Didn't get into the actor studio.
Yes,
made his own studio.
Right. Like hyper committed, live it out actors who wind up allegorizing this whole thing of not being a good actor or not really meaning it. And the minute you don't mean it, that's what gets you like the devil and a huge hit. So, but that I think speaks to the sort of weird compulsion seduction of these kinds of performances. You know, you just can't help it.
Mm-hmm.
It's so tempting, both to sell out and to transform, which is the same thing.
I want to leave time for questions from our observers here, but I would like to just ask one more to you, David, because there's a really interesting bit where you, or rather your interlocutor yammers on about the moment of reveal when performance announces itself as such, and you talk about this Vito Acconci piece, you talk about the like candid camera gotcha moment, the invasion of the body snatchers, and all of these things. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, because this is preceded by discussion of conceptual or post-conceptual art and the degree to which meaning is available via wall didactic or press kit. All these things pertaining to what makes work self-explanatory, or does work, when a performance only becomes a performance by announcement. And all of these things seem to pertain to method in ways that I don't immediately perceive, but am totally fascinated by the way that you circle the issue. Is it, to your mind, a performance that announces itself as performance? Is it, to your mind, a wall didactic that gives you or impresses some kind of context on performance?
Wait, do you mean the method, or do you mean my larger argument?
Let us begin with the method and spiral out.
Oh man, I mean, I think the problem, the progression of ideas made sense to me as I was writing it, and the progression of ideas still kind of makes sense to me. I think that if you follow the monologue, it kind of starts off with this basic problem that I was always really interested in, of like, how little it takes to turn something into a performance. And the whole thing about Body Snatchers is, if you, the Philip Kaufman version, like if you pretty much, and I was also this goes back to your question about stars, or about like the also rans. And I'm really, kind of always fascinated by how little it takes to make something into a performance. And really what it takes is for a bunch of people to point at you, and the next minute you're performing, and you either do it well or you don't, or it's like, and you either deal with that kind of attention well or you don't. So I think, the outer ring of that monologue is sort of like, the minimal conditions of performance. And then as it goes further and further in, and also just how weirdly antisocial this idea of, because the monologue just wants to fit in, and at a certain point it realizes it can't fit in because it's scripted and it can't actually have a real interaction. All it can do is monologue. And at a certain point it becomes an artwork and it becomes special, like it becomes the star, but actually it just wants to blend in. So then the question is like, but how does anybody deal with not being the star? Or how does anybody deal with just being normal? So there's this tension between just wanting to fit in and wanting to be special. And this is what the monologue is trying to navigate. It keeps trying to decide whether or not it really wants to leave the gallery, or whether it wants to stay in and be the smartest artwork in the room. And I think that's my, so I think that I personally have a great distaste for performances that announce themselves as performances. So for me, my ideals are these very invisible things. And, but if you're really committed to that, then, which I'm clearly not committed enough to that, then you have to deal with these kind of ta-da kind of moments where, it announces itself as a performance, which just seems like thirsty. So I'm constantly torn in this push-pull of like, do you want attention or do you not? How anonymous are you willing to be? But I think that as the monologue circles, it gets into this idea of like this sort of method self-exposure where you rip yourself inside out, which doesn't require an audience, I think. I mean, I hadn't really thought of it in these terms, but it kind of transcends this issue, because you could rip yourself out for nobody and it would still be a performance. Like that's what the method, and this is what, Shonni and I talked a lot about. One of the, we think of like actors studio, these kind of acting schools, like these labs, as having been around for a really long time. But the idea of acting for nobody but a bunch of other actors, the idea of getting a performance together that wasn't supposed to be on stage, the idea of acting as craft, this is an invention of, the actor studio, and really Strasberg was when we concretized it. And the idea of it was that you could do these performances for nobody. You could do these performances in private. You could do like emotional memory, sense memory. These things are fucking bonkers. But I think they're a way of, so yes, I think for the method actor, it's a way of transcending this fundamentally tragic divide between, are you going to be part of a community, or are you going to stand apart, or are you going to stand apart or be ostracized from the community as a performer? And this solution is, well, just don't leave the house at all and just keep ripping yourself inside out. Be Charlie Sheen with the mirror. And, you know, you haven't solved the community problem, but at least you've gotten rid of the split, but just ignoring society altogether.
I want to throw out to the room, the virtual room, if there are any questions, to the little Q&A box, which I suppose is how we're meant to do this. And barring that, I'll just continue to persecute you guys until there is no more time left.
Just
waiting for the. Go ahead.
Just one quick anecdote on that note, which is, you know, Robert Pattinson was doing an interview with Jennifer Lopez, and he had this amazing line. They were both slagging off on, like, you know, living the role, while also being like, yeah, of course I like to live the role. But Pattinson was like, here's what never happens. No one's ever walking around the set being an incredibly nice person to everybody. And, you know, somebody's like, hey, what's up, man? You know, you're being so nice. And the person's like, I'm just getting into character. Like, that never happens. It's always an excuse for asocial behavior somehow. And I'm misquoting him. He said it much more elegantly, but.
I mean, that actually links back to something I wanted to say after your last comment, David, which is that, you know, yes, the idea is to spill your guts, open yourself, you know, relive your childhood trauma. But in fact, as you know, as we know, and this is sort of what those anecdotes like Martin Sheen and getting drunk and, you know, punching the mirror reveal, it's, you know, it's actually, there's nothing sort of like this excavation actually requires a lot of like a large apparatus, right? It's not like you just sort of like take off your shirt and you're there, right? There's actually it's less about sort of exposing and more in a lot of ways about layering stuff on top. And a lot of what does get layered on top of a certain idea about, about antisocial behavior maybe, or about masculinity often. And that, you know, that's we're taught that that's a vision of the true self, but of course it's, you know, it's something that we put on top of whatever it is we are.
A question comes.
Might rise or might already exist as alternatives to method.
Battery 100% connected.
Oh, are we still there?
Yeah. What do you think might rise or might already exist as an alternative to method?
Well, I mean, this was sort of what I wrote about in that piece called The Great Recession, which was for a now departed film comment.
I'm going to put it in the chat.
Where I met the good Nick Pinkerton. But, you know, I think the real question is, will the acting school industrial complex survive when the method is truly dispensed with? I don't know, because in order to have an acting school, you have to have something to teach at that school. And I'm not, you know, although for sure lots of acting schools try to teach things that are other than Stanislavski, or what's like loosely called the method, to answer another question that's in the chat. But it never quite congeals into something that, you know, a coherent curriculum that students, you know, American students anyways, seem to want to commit, you know, large sums of money and time to. So, I mean, I think that method acting in some ways is already long dead, and that's why we have these, you know, the like method for laughs genre that, you know, like the comedy Barry is one of those, like the Kaminsky method, right? Like there are lots of actually now comedies about that are making fun of method acting and parodying some of its excesses. But I think, you know, the question of will there ever be something that supersedes both sort of the you know, the coherent, semi-coherent, but in some ways coherent methodology that method acting instilled as the path for, to become an actor? Will there ever be anything that supersedes that in an American context? And then the other question is, even if there is, will people still want to do it if it doesn't have the guru structure that was so central to all the different method acting schools? And we talked the most about Strasberg, but again, just to answer somebody in the chat, there were many others. There's Stella Adler and Sanford Meisner and Uta Hagen, lots of other acting teachers who have different methods, and they're not all like Strasberg's in a lot of ways, but they do all rely on this sort of guiding light of a very strong authority figure who leads actors through the ringer in order to arrive at some ideal. So I don't know if the structure of institutionalized actor training would survive the real loss of
I think also that I think the question isn't so much what might rise in already existing alternative method is actually nothing. Acting is easy. Anybody can do it. Like, if you're comfortable being watched, you can be an actor. But the minute you decide that the idea that one needs to be trained, at least the American version of this, is itself a product of the method. So all training in America, no, you could train in a million alternative theaters. The really terrifying prospect is that you don't actually need to do any training at all. You just show up and you do it, and you're reasonably persuasive or you're not. Don't wear yourself out. So I think that's actually the scary possibility, is no training. And that's constantly where this film theater, kind of like testiness happens, which is like, oh yeah, you can be a film actor, you just need big eyes. But to really tread upon the boards, you need training, which, yeah, I guess, sure. But you need to be able to speak loud, and but there's just a whole set of complexes built up around this. And I think what's really useful to bear in mind is that it might just be something you just happen to be able to do pretty casually.
I sort of agree with that. But the problem is that it's not just about the actors, right? It's also about the drama that is, the writing, the plays that are being done, the films that are being made, the narratives that they have attached to them, and it's all sort of a part of this, particular understanding of what acting is, So I think there are a lot of alternatives out there, and maybe one will rise above, but I'm not sure it'll ever, have the same, it will never congeal so many things in the way that method acting did because of its particular position in the explosion of the culture industry and the rise of film.
Yeah, it's really hard to do psychological realism without some legacy of that.
We've got the Q&A is popping off, so if I could interject, a question comes up. I'm curious. I think the question is, I'm curious as to if you both think this is/isn't tied to genius, and perhaps specifically to white cis male genius talent, because so many famous method actors are white cis men traditionally. Shonni, you certainly speak to the Jewishness of the phenomenon and the degree to which this is so often overlooked, but perhaps there's more to dig into here.
Yeah, definitely. A lot to say about that. Right. So I think that the point of the section in my essay that I read for Hanukkah today is, it's about assimilation to whiteness. So it's about assimilation to Jewish assimilation and longings for participation and hegemony. So to that, and although many of the acting teachers were Jewish, of course, famously, so many of the actors were Italian or, various other like becoming white ethnicities mostly. That said, there were actually a couple of very, very interesting Black method actors and method directors. William Greaves is the one I write about in my book, who was actually a teacher at the Actors Studio in addition to a documentarian. So there are exceptions to this, but it is true that the the vision of the method actor is actually sort of an ethnic white cishet male. Although, you know, the ways that this gets articulated can also include, you know, there's like on the borders of that figuration are some other, you know, other really interesting things can come in, and, you know, a film like Dog Day Afternoon is sort of about that. That's like about sort of what's like actually on the periphery of this certain figuration. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
I'm a big fan in this context. I mean, the director notwithstanding, the cishet nature of the director notwithstanding, I'm a big fan of Tangerine when thinking about this, because I feel like Tangerine's really like pitting two dramas and two acting styles against each other. So, you know, at the core of, you know, not the core of it, but you've got this especially more off to the side, but you've got this like very conventional, like, you know, like drama of this Armenian cab driver who, you know, has this like stable family structure, and yet he's addicted to having, you know, sex with trans sex workers, or, you know, and like in a way that's like classic fodder for like, you know, a kind of method performance and a kind of classical method dramaturgy. And on the border of it, but actually it's the main story at the same time, you've got it much more so than the Armenian cab driver. You've got this kind of story which, you know, of this community of people who kind of keep betraying each other, but, you know, in a classic method story, the betrayals would lead to like a really terminal breach or like a really massive reconciliation. But the relationships just keep shifting around, you know, between like the trans characters of color and the white and the sort of white cisgendered characters, and they keep kind of realigning themselves into different groups that don't suffer these like grand tragic family breaches. And at the end, you've got this very, very kind of amazing scene in the laundromat where, like, you know, she just gives her wig, and it's this very, you know, but so basically, and the acting style, you know, between one group of actors and the other is itself extremely, like, that seems like one alternative to method realism, right? Like, is what I mean, obviously, like filmmaking and camera work, all these things play roles, but the ways in which that story is told does not seem methody in the slightest, you know. And then in the middle of it, you've got this very conventional story, which seems extremely methody. So I think that's actually a really good study in how, like, in the interaction between acting styles and narratives, and how they're very hard. It's very hard to pull one out from the other. So, but yes, I basically agree. It's a predominantly, you know, and even in symbiote psychotaxiplasm, you know, which Shonni and I also really grooved on a lot, you know, which is William Greaves's. Well, I mean, he's made a lot of amazing films, but it's the one I get kind of most obsessed by. You know, the best actor in it, like, there's multiple acting styles. There's commercial, there's method, there's what Greaves is doing. But the hands down fantastic performance is Victor Vikovsky, the drunk, who kind of slides in at the end and just kind of smokes everybody. And he's not trying to be real. He's just doing this thing that he does.
Another question poses, why does everyone love jokes about actors? I'm thinking of Broadway crowds roaring with laughter at those moments in slave play. What do they have at stake here? Why does everyone love jokes about actors?
I mean, I think every reason that's in the book, you know, I mean, right? Because, yes, because actors seem to be doing something that we all both love and hate about ourselves. So it's a lot easier to like exercise it, you know, by laughing at it.
But I think it's also the same reason that, like, you know, the same reason that they become conduits for Satan, you know, or that they're figured as becoming conduits for Satan, is there's this, like, actors get an incredibly bum rap for their choice of profession, because their choice of profession, like being double or whatever that is, just seems like, yeah, like Shonni's saying, it's too close. But also, you know, you read like Rousseau on actors, or, you know, they lack integrity somehow. They can't just be one thing. And instead of being like, that's awesome, they can't be one thing, you know, that's great, they can be like 5 or 6 things, there's a sense of like, they're figures of, you know, massive distrust, but then also figures of massive scorn. I mean, this is what, I mean, Barry's an okay show, but I still, like, as much ambivalence as I have towards theater, and as much ambivalence as I have towards the method, and as much ambivalence as I have towards like the category of acolyte generally, I don't actually know why this job should line you up for such suspicion and such contempt. Because, I mean, the whole point of that headshot show, which was in a gallery, you know, like the next day after my opening, you know, it was like thousands of headshots. It looked like post, you know, September 11th missing persons thing. And everyone's like, ha, 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 look at these people who want jobs. Ha, 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 look at these headshots. And the next day, somebody who was at that opening, like, walks in with her portfolio to show it to my gallerist. You know, and it's like, this is what we are all doing all the fucking time in this world.
Well, but that's why we laugh at it, right? Because
yeah, that's why we laugh at it.
Yeah.
But it just seems like
it's the overtness of
wrong.
the selling yourself, right? I mean, that's the
yeah.
So that we don't want to be reminded that we're all selling ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Hate the game.
Speaking of which,
we're selling.
Available at a discount code.
book.
There's so many good
lovely
questions
book.
in the Q&A. Oh my God, I can't believe it.
And I feel very poorly, but much like the actor who is 2 things at once, I will shortly have to be on another Zoom babbling about Fruit Chan's 1997 film Made in Hong Kong to some sullen SVA students. So I myself must recuse myself. Before I do so, I will say, as I was saying to you before we hopped on this thing, I was just so delighted by this book. I just so impressed with it, and it's so smart and does so many interesting things, and a brisk read, and I've learned so much about the fact that Lee Strasberg is, in fact, the coiled snake at the heart of 20th century American culture. And I encourage all to run out and purchase. I have to make my curtain call. I don't know if we should all.
I think we should. But wait, can I take this opportunity to say that Nick Pinkerton also has an excellent Substack that you should all Google and subscribe to and pay money to subscribe to, because he's a really, really essential critic of our time. And now he's frozen, so I could say whatever else.
We froze him with
Nick, I just sold your Substack.
We'll subscribe.
Okay.
I thought one more glitch before I went would be good.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Nick. I'm looking at all these questions, and they're kind of amazing. And I hope that, Lisa, can we keep these questions, or do they vanish? Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks so much. I'll screenshot the questions.
Good.
Okay. Anyways, thank you guys for attending. We really had a good time, and thank you again, N+1. The book is $14. We have a 20% off code. N+1 is an amazing magazine. And also, I put Shonni's essay in the chat about contemporary movie acting. It is actually the most important essay you will read if you want to understand this. And that costs you nothing. So, all right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.
And thank you, Lisa.
Guys, so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate.
Bye.